G'day everyone. Welcome to our webinar looking at seasonal snapshot and when to start. My name's Marek, I'm from AgLogic, and we did one of these a few months ago after going to the northwest and seeing what the conditions were like, and after coming back from last week from King Island and seeing how the data can sometimes not quite match reality, mainly because we didn't have a large enough data set. It gave us a bit of a prompt to do one today again. So what we will do is we'll have a bit of a seasonal snapshot of what's going on around the state in terms of soil moisture monitoring, soil moisture, and then we'll talk about irrigation and when to start and things to consider. After sitting down and putting this together, it's shown that it's not a one-stop shop or one fits all. I think it's a matter of really focusing on how it fits in with your enterprise. If you turn up late, you can there's a recording for this as well that you can go back to. So we'll get into it. So the moisture probes locations, the one thing to consider here is that they're put in a representative pasture and soil type within the area, so within their region. All the sites are a combination of AgLogic weather station networks and also farming forecaster sites. So they were all funded through AgriFutures or the TAS Farm Innovation Hub. So there's about 80 of those dotted around the state. When we install these in a landscape, we try and put it on the dry side of average. So we don't want to go too wet, don't want to really plonk it on an average, but we want to go to the dry side of average. So we kind of get that early warning system for when things are starting to dry off or when the pasture's drawing moisture down deeper in the profile. So with that in mind, use it as a reference for the variability that you see on your farm. So if you have wet areas, they might take off a bit later than other areas because they sit wet, or if you have drier, sandier banks, they might dry out sooner than the others. So what it is just getting a bit of an understanding about where you sit in compared to that site. So the things that are affecting the soil moisture levels with the specific location is the soil type first and foremost. So the water holding capacity is determined by soil type. If it's a heavy clay, it's got greater water holding capacity. If it's a sandier, lighter soil, it holds less water and it dries out more quickly as the pasture or the crop dries that soil out. But also infiltration, so that you might get that rainfall, but it might drain to the deep drain out the bottom of the profile. Rainfall efficacy is another one as well, so how efficient the rainfall is, and that usually comes down to application rate. Nice soaking rainfall will have a greater impact in terms of filling up your stored subsoil moisture. Heavy rainfall, especially in dry conditions, can mean that you get a lot more runoff and deep drainage in soils that are prone to cracking. And then also topography. Location, so topography, so where it's sitting on the hill aspect, north facing, south facing, things like that. So these are other things to consider. So we've just done a bit of a quick snapshot of where our moisture deficits are sitting at the moment. So King Island, I mentioned, was one that is quite behind in terms of rainfall in soil moisture. Pardon me, and that was kind of the driver to have this webinar. But also that northwest coast, that circular head region, is below that still that full point. As we go through the northwest coast, they're pretty much, as a general rule, close to full point. And then as we come down into the southern Midlands, it starts to dry out a lot more. But we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Another quick the numbers that we just ran this morning was to show you where we are to date in terms of our rainfall. So some of the sites that are dotted around, I've just picked a random handful to show you what the rainfall is to date and what that same year to 30-year average is to the same time of the year. So you can see as a general we're behind that circular head region here. Is an area which is falling behind, but a lot of those areas, Yola and Deloraine and Sassafras, that are still behind in the rainfall. They've actually hit their full points, but we'll discuss what that means further in a minute. So first we'll go to the northwest and have a look at the moisture probe data that we have. So first thing we've got here is Montague, which was kind of one that I used as a proxy for King Island because we didn't have enough data within King Island. And we can see here that we are not quite at that full moisture level there. So at the same point last year, we were full. All right, we were at that the maximum stored subsoil moisture. We can see here that's our empty point. So that's where we drew down that moisture in about that March, and then we started to get that refill in autumn. We started to use that up, but then that winter recharge started. So if you want, we've got to the next slide. We'll see that this is the reason why that we haven't got to the same point. So this is more of your typical northwest coast at circular head rainfall pattern in June, July, that winter rainfall pattern, and that's what we need to get this soil from midway point all the way up to our full point. Okay, so we can see here that we just never received that rainfall to replicate that same filling up of the soil moisture profile. So that's a bit of an indication of why we're behind. So that's thinking about how we look at this data. We want to compare it to what is a normal year. So what is our average year? What are we used to produce? What are we used to growing and grazing in our normal enterprises? Instead of trying to, I know there's a bit of distrust for medium to long range forecasts, and some of us just kind of hope for a good spring or hope that things work out. But what I like to do is just compare it to what's normal. Compare it to what you normally have in terms of stocking rate, when you sow, when you harvest, all those kind of things. And then what it does, it just gives you a bit of that relativity in terms of where we are sitting. So this is an important slide because it shows you what we usually see. Okay, and this is obviously far off normal, but if we go further down the northwest coast, we'll go to the South Riona. Okay, same thing. Really nice rainfall in that June, July, which sat us up with that full point for a long period of time. Now, while we're at that same full point now, we can see that we haven't had that same winter refill. Okay, we haven't had that. That hasn't been replicated. Now, you might say, so what? We're at the same point. Well, the impact that has here is when your pasture is active. Now, this is a dairy pasture. This is on, but it is still a dryland pasture, so it's not irrigated. It's a dairy ryegrass pasture. So what we can see here is we're in a period of prolonged waterlogging. Now, what that does is it slows down pasture growth. So because that pasture is sitting wet, it doesn't grows efficiently. Now, we haven't had a period of waterlogging here at all. We haven't sat wet. The pasture hasn't been sitting there waiting to go. So any moisture that does fall is going into pasture growth. And when I've spoken to a lot of people around the state in terms of where they're sitting, they're saying it is a fantastic August. We haven't had this much, or we haven't had a August this good since a long time, or since I can remember. So that's great. But the big questions arise from that was, well, what does that mean for your feed window? What does that mean for when your feed's going to grow? How quickly is that going to draw up that subsoil moisture? And when will your feed to peak feed production drop off? If it starts earlier, like it is this year, does that mean it'll finish earlier? So these are the kind of things that you need to consider when it comes to stocking rate, when you're shifting cattle, or when your bulk feed period is important to your enterprise. So if we jump over to the northeast, we can see here Winnaleah is pretty similar to last year. It is sitting a bit under, but that's because the moisture, the rainfall that's come through has been really nice. It hasn't been sitting wet, and the pasture's been using that rainfall. So you can see here you've got that nice drawdown of moisture from the pasture throughout the winter. And as we swing further along to the more northeast, rainfall hasn't been as high in that part of the country, about the part of the state, I mean, and so we can see we've still got about a bit of ways to go before we get to that full point there. So it's that more of that filling up of that subsoil moisture to really reach the same levels that we got at the same time last year. So again, so you look at these two and say, well, we're ticking along quite nicely. We're close to full point. Our pasture's growing. Our peak growing season might finish a bit earlier, whereas you go a bit further east and you might go, well, yes, we might be growing really good pasture, but because we have less stored subsoil moisture, does that mean my peak period is going to finish a bit earlier? Do I have to pull? Are there levers I can pull when it comes to prolonging that or making the most of the pasture that I'm growing at the moment? So if we go more to the Northern Midlands, this one here is of the last webinar we did, so don't panic, those guys around Hagley. But what I thought I'd do, just as a bit of a comparison, is go, well, where we are now. So we can see if we just flick between the two, again, see where we were, and we can see that full point. You can see that how we've crept up to that full point. So we've got nice, consistent rainfall that has got us up to that point there. But similar to that South Rhino site, we haven't had that period of waterlogging that we would have had last year. Okay, so again, everything's going to take off quicker because the water's there. There's not an anaerobic environment, so the pasture will take off a lot sooner. If we then go down to Bishopsburn, similar tale. We're pretty close to 4 point, which is fantastic, but we haven't had that period of waterlogging, so things will kick off a lot sooner. And then Elsdon, which a bit further down south. Now, this is where they were in early June last year. Things weren't looking crash hot, but a few rainfall events that came through in July and August have got things up to pretty much where we'd like to be. But as you can see, the rain that's falling is starting to be used, and we do need a little bit more to get us up to that period. So this is a nice, the soil moisture is in a nice situation, but again, just considering what that means for the rest of the year. What is it? How do we compare that to an average year when we would be sitting wet? So if we go down south a bit more, we've got down at Lewisham, just south of Campbelltown. We can see here that at the June last year, they were just creeping above 50%. So if we go till now, they're pretty much at that same level, just a little bit higher. So we can see here they had a couple of rainfall events that filled up a little bit of our subsoil down here because this is a sandier site, but we can see that that's either drained or has been used up. So we haven't had that winter refill that we would like in that part of the state. And that's pretty much because if you look at the August, 17 mils within August, when we're looking at hopefully that more of that winter recharge through June, July, August. And then if we go further down south to Rathani, so around that Woodbury area, things were looking dire at that same time back in June, and it's only just picked up a little bit more. And they, as I said, they had the same rainfall that Lewisham had, but that's also being used up, and that only really penetrated the top 30 centimetres. So in terms of filling up subsoil moisture, we've still got a fair gap there. And again, you look at that August rainfall up till now, it's been pretty low and lower year to date rainfall as well than we had at Lewisham. So I did a bit of a cross check between annual rainfall and the soil moisture, and things pretty much line up as you would expect. So if you go to the east coast in the Fingal Valley, we've got here at Milton, so north of Swansea, is at Cranbrook, and so you can see here that the large rainfall event. Now these soils, the east coast, they do have cracking. They do crack. They're quite vertic, so you will see these sort of spiking events here. Now, for those soils to wet up and have their maximum water holding capacity, they need to go through a nice wet winter or have a couple of those nice east coast lows. So we had this rainfall event here, which did fill that up to a degree, but still, there's still a bit more rainfall that we need there to get it to that what we call proper winter refill. So that was back in June, and we can see here we've got those east coast lows there that just fill that up nicely. So we can see there's still a bit of cracking there, but we're pretty close to. So that northern east coast region there is looking pretty good, and they've had that through about 330 mils to date, which is about bang on par with what they'd usually have. But then we go down to Kelvin. So if you remember that 335 mils that they've had year to date. So then we go to Kelvin, which is 30 odd k's down the coast. And this is a soil that does have preferential flow. So instead of filling from the top down, it fills from the bottom up. We can see back in June where we were sitting, things weren't looking too crash hot. And within the 3 months since, things have picked up marginally, but only from this rainfall here. So if we have a look at that rainfall they've had from that 330, they've had a lot less rainfall as you go further south, that 220 mils. So that's the real reason why that's happened there. Now, as you can see here, this soil fills from the bottom up. So we've got that infiltration down at depth. Now, these layers won't wet up fully until these layers do. So you can see here a bit of preferential flow. So these soils really need that nice soaking rain to be able to wet the profile up. A large rainfall here, which is about an inch that fell in July, that went here into that subsoil as opposed to filling up from the top down. Then we go along to the east coast, so Kiliman, which is in between St Mary's and Fingal. So you can see here back in June, most of this is a sandier soil, lighter soil. So as opposed to Kelvin, which is a cracking clay, this one does fill from the top down. And you can see here a lot of that rainfall in early winter was filling up those top 60 centimetres. And we can see here on the left-hand side, if you look at those, the traffic light system will pretty dry, bone dry down at depth. So that was back in June. And if we do a comparison now, we had a bit of a issue with the telemetry unit, but it was back online. But you can see it hasn't really jumped up that much. It's had rainfall there, but not what you'd consider a normal rainfall from in that Fingal or that St Mary's region, and none of that has reached that subsoil moisture. So going into this season, yes, you might have really good growth because the pasture is relying on that moisture in the top 40 centimetres, top 50 centimetres, but there's nothing at depth to keep it going throughout that season. So that's one to keep an eye on in the Fingal Valley. As we come a bit further west to Speyside, which is closer, which is I guess the western side of Fingal, we can see here in June. Same thing, slowly had that refill coming through, but as we come along, they're looking at a bit better situation than further east, filling up a bit more at depth from the rainfall that we had in early August as well. But still, they're not full by any means, and that they're matching here is what they were at last year. So to get to that point that we want to, kind of reset things, we want to go through our typical wet winter, which we haven't seen for 2 years pretty much now. Hopefully we get that rain through this week, but without preempting what's going to happen for the rest of winter and spring, I don't think we're going to get to that winter recharge that we want. So it's going to be 2 fairly dry winters for the Fingal Valley. From the data that we've got. If we go into the Derwent Valley, this is a great example of how you can only trust the data that you've got. And if you look at here in Dungrove, so just north of Bothwell, you can see here that I've put a full line here based on last winter. So the probe got put in was it September? In May. We can see that I've made the assumption that this is from the data we've got that we're our full point. Now you can see here in June, this is where we're sitting. If we come to now, we can see that the line that I had there was wrong. Based on when I installed that moisture probe, which is a sandier site, you can see here that we had no stored subsoil moisture. So what we can take from that is in June last year, the pasture had already drawn up a fair bit of moisture through that autumn where we hadn't got that winter recharge that we would usually expect to get in that May, June period. But this year they've got some of those rains in July, which Bothwell were getting some of the largest rainfall events in that July month, which was quite out of the norm, but it was fantastic for them. As you can see, we got recharge of that subsoil moisture, which we never got last winter. So they're in that Derwent Valley there is in a better position than they were last year. But I would have as a guess that they're not at a saturation point either, looking at how that passes drawing that moisture up. If we go a bit further south, same thing, weather on. Closer to Bothwell, you can see here I've put a line based on the data that I had, made that assumption. It was pretty dry, but the same rainfall that Dungrove got has put that back up. So as you can see here, we are above where we were. So I'll have to shift these lines to take into account the new data that we have. But as you can see here, we did draw up subsoil moisture at depth in January. And apologies if you can't see the cursor. I should have made it big before I before I started the webinar, but it slipped my mind, so apologies for that. But as we can see here at that 80 centimetre depth, we did draw up some subsoil moisture, but we haven't reached that point there. So we're not at a full point there because that water hasn't, that rainfall hasn't got all the way down to 80 centimetres. And you would expect to see, hopefully, yes, that's filling up, but hopefully you see that recharge. So I don't reckon we're quite at our maximum, which is a good and a bad thing. It means your soil's got the capacity to hold more water, which is a good thing, but bad news is we're not quite there yet, I don't think. And then if you go further down south in the Coal Valley, Daisy Bank's just out of Richmond. You can see here that in June, we were at a pretty dire situation. A lot of that moisture at 80 centimetres was being drawn up. It was being supplemented a bit through that rainfall, but not enough to keep up with the pasture growth. But if we then come through here and see that the rainfall that we got in July did fill things up, there was that southeaster that came through the south and east parts of the state, which made a big difference. But a lot of that's been taken up now. Again, I'll talk about that soils that have that preferential flow or that cracking. This is one of those sites. So it's really important to understand your soil types and how they behave. If you've got cracking and your soils has large cracks in it, and you get rainfall in autumn, if that rainfall only goes down to 80, 90 centimetres, is that actually part of your autumn break? If you have a lighter soil that does fill from the top down, that inch of rain that you might get in autumn is actually going towards your autumn break. So understanding where your water's sitting in your profile is important to know whether it's worth anything to you in terms of pasture growth, depending on the time of year. So you look at all this data here and you go, this is pretty funky data that's going on. The probe must be broken, or it must be poor installation. This is pretty much how these soils behave. They will do weird things until they wet up fully, and we haven't got that yet down through the Coal Valley. And this picture kind of illustrates why. So this is a picture from Marcus Hardy's PhD, which is a diatracer study. And I pull this up at most of my workshops and most of my webinars because it just really highlights and refreshes us how, if you've seen it before, refreshes us how random soils can behave when they're dry and they shrink and swell and they've got cracks and the preferential pathways, whether they be sand infills. In this case, it's a duplex soil, so sandy loam over clay. It sits, it goes through the profile, it sits on top of the clay, and then it finds a crack, and away it goes. These are the kind of things that we need to consider when our soils are refilling through winter. So hopefully they'll be full by June, but in most of the cases around the state at the moment, they're not. So this is an important thing to understand your soils and where your water is actually going. If we jump across to Flinders Island, again in June, we could see things through in the middle of the island were a bit below par, but we can see here that they have got a bit of rainfall, but that's been used up. So we've got a bit of winter, a bit of recharge at depth, but a lot of the pasture is using a lot of that as we're going, and it's been a pretty dry winter compared to what we had last year, as we can see where we're sitting. And then if we go to Happy Valley, which is closer to White Mark, which is on pretty much beach sand, we can see a few months ago they were below halfway, but then they've got some rainfall events nestled under there at Mount Strzelecki. They've got some rainfall events which have filled that right up. It's similar drawdown from that part that's being used at Dingira, but just the fact that it's a lighter, sandier soil means it took less water rainfall for it to fill up. And then we swing across to King Island, which is, I guess, the reason why that we looking at the data and jumping across to the circular head is the reason why we thought, well, we need to do a webinar to try and hopefully get an understanding of where we're sitting. If we look at Bargara, which is in the middle of the island, where they were last year, where they were in June this year, we can see that, yeah, they had some nice rainfall that coming through July and August, which has got them close to that point there. But this is a similar story, I think, to what we saw with the data in the Derwent Valley. Okay, the line that I've put there is based on the information that we had, but I expect this line would go a bit higher based on the being over there and actually digging holes, and again comparing it to what is the norm. So I was digging holes there to about 2 foot. There was no free water to depth of 2 foot, and let alone the fact that I shouldn't even actually have been able to stand in that spot without gumboots in this time of the year. So again, referring back to what's normal as opposed to what you normally see, as opposed to what's going on now. So I reckon these guys have a similar to the Drought Valley. From last year, they have a bit more ways to go. So that's just a bit of a snapshot on where everything's sitting. That data's come from the AgLogic Weather Station Network and also Farming Forecaster sites, as I said. So if you want to delve more into that, just get in contact with me, and yeah, we can pull up relevant sites and have a bit more of a deep dive into what that data's telling you, and how that might work in regards to your strategic grazing or irrigation or things like that. So what we'll do now is talk about soil moisture irrigation and when to start. Now, this is a difficult one to do because it's not one size fits all when you delve more into it. So the things that we really need to consider are the region you're in, the enterprise that you're dealing with. Are you mostly sheep, cattle, both? Are you mixed cropping? So you mix that grazing, and you've also got cropping coming online. And with crops, the sowing date. If you've got an autumn a crop that was sown in last autumn, such as carrot seeds or pyrethrum or your winter cereals that are in, the way that you would look at starting to irrigate those is different to what your spring sowing crops would be. And irrigating your pastures your perennial pastures are different as well. The other consideration is what's in your dam. Are your dams fully recharged, or do you rely on water allocation? Is the water allocation at 100%, or has it been cut back, or things like that? So there's a number of things to consider. Like I said, we might be at a 4 point, but the 4 point is only, if we've just reached the 4 point, that means we haven't had those 2-3 months of recharge to fill dams, to fill irrigation schemes that we would in a normal year. All right, so make sure we compare it to that average year. So if we go with what I'll talk about in the next few slides about that irrigation and when to start, the cropping breakdown will be, I'll break them into 4 different components: dryland grazing, irrigated perennial grazing, cropping, and I'll break those into autumn sowing and spring sowing, the things we need to consider there. So with the dryland grazing, covered this a bit with the graphs that we've just looked at. So I guess, when is the start of spring growth? Is it earlier this year than usual? And I would say, driving around the place and talking to clients and talking to people, I've spoken to a fair few people around the island at the moment, just to get a bit of an idea of the data that I'm seeing sitting here in my office is matching what they're seeing in terms of their grazing and their pasture growth. All right, so I think across the state, it's fair to say that this year is early, and people are saying that it feels like we're in spring already based on that pasture growth. All right, no worries. We know that. The reason why, has it been a wet winter? No, it hasn't. Now, the reason that we've got earlier pasture growth has been a bit milder, apart from those cracking frosts that we had 4 or 5 weeks ago, is that the fact that it hasn't been a wet winter, so we're not sitting wet, we're not sitting waterlogged, so we're not in an anaerobic environment. So usually this time of year would still be sitting wet. So pasture has wet feet, anaerobic environment, it's not going to take off. We haven't been sitting wet, yes, and there's available soil moisture. We're at field capacity. It is perfect conditions for pasture to grow. So away they go. All right. So what does that mean for your feed window? Okay. If it's starting earlier, does that mean it finishes earlier? All right. What are our subsoil moisture levels at? If you're at full point, then you've got your full capacity to draw on. If we're not at our full point, such as the circular head, then we haven't got the amount to draw on as we would in a normal year. So again, if I pointed this graph here at South Rona, you can see where the pastures grow. That pasture growth that we've got in this part of the year, that would usually be happening in a month or two's time, okay, because we've been sitting wet. All right, so this waterlogged environment has delays when your pasture takes off. Well, it's taken off now because we're not sitting wet in that waterlogged environment. Now, in a dryland environment, that's going to use that water. That's going to follow that same water uptake there. Unless we have an absolutely cracking spring, what you can do is just take that period there and shift it across a month or two. So if you look at what your average year is, what does that mean? Does that just shift our 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 feed window? All right. But like I said, if we have a cracking spring, then it just could be a year out of the box, and it could prolong through to that January, December, January. So, and then we look at that Montague. So if we compare the two, so I've got that South Rhine station, that's pretty good. But as we look at Montague, same thing, good pasture growth. But the fact is they have, 25 to 30% less stored subsoil moisture to draw on. So that's important to understand. The conditions might look the same now, but what happens is your feed window is compressed because you're just going to run out sooner because of the moisture that's available. So that's based. That's there is, when irrigation isn't a lever to pull because it's a dry land pasture, that's pretty simple. But when we do have irrigation as a lever to pull, when do we actually start? Now, irrigation comes sooner than we think, and we often start too late. The big reason behind that is we follow the wrong visual cues. The things that we see that drive our decision making as human beings, we're very visual. The things that drive our decision making is confirmation bias. The things that we start to see all the time that we remember are what kind of sits in our brain. Now, what we do is we follow we see the wet parts of the paddock, and that's what's telling us what's going on. We see the puddles in the driveway, and that's in our mind telling us that it's still wet. Or more to the point, the things that give us the shits or the things that piss us off, they're the things that really kind of stick in our head. Now, the reason why those parts of the paddock are wet, they have no growth, or you get bogged in, is because they're the low-lying parts of the paddock. They're parts that perennially get wet because topographically that's where the water flows. And because the water sits there, you don't get as much plant growth. So if you don't get enough plant growth, your ETOs decrease. So the amount of water that gets lost from those parts of the paddock is decreased as well. Soil structure is not as good there because it sits wet and it's more of an anaerobic environment. So things just don't grow as well there either. You don't. If it's poor soil structure, poorer drainage. So there's a lot of things that compound that mean that those parts of the paddocks which become the parts that you try to avoid, or the parts that become issues when it comes to the management side of things, there's reasons why they're like that. But don't let that pull down the performance of the best performing parts of your paddock, because the dry areas, the higher slopes or the lighter soils that have freer draining, they might be taking off. Now, if you hold back your irrigation because of those wet areas, well, that can affect the hold back the best performing parts of paddock, and there can be flow-on effects for the rest of the year. Now, you might go, Marek, that's all well and good, but I don't want to get bogged there again. Well, if it's an issue that is holding back the best performing parts of your paddock, is drainage. Do you need to do some proper drainage? Is there something you can do to make sure that you improve one part of the paddock to make sure the other part of the paddock subsequently improves as well? So these are the kind of questions you need to ask in terms of managing on a whole topographic paddock level. So these flow-on effects that we talked about the last all season can be pretty much summed up in this graph here. So if we then use those wet areas to drive our decision making when we start irrigating, and we keep looking at them going, well, it's wet, we're not going to irrigate. There's things we need to do before we switch on that pump, or before we get the pivot going around, is, check nozzles, make sure there's no rust in the system, make sure it's putting on proper irrigation, the right amount. So we do that. That's a job you got to do beforehand as well. So there's all these things you got to consider before you even look at doing your first irrigation run. But the thing that we want to look at here is summed up beautifully in this graph. So 2021 was a pretty good spring in terms of the rainfall that was falling. So we can see here, this is our winter refill. This is our winter full point, okay? So don't look at this graph and think this is what's going to be happening this year. This will be happening now. September is when this will be happening. So we want to start thinking about this now. So we can see here, we've got that soil moisture uptake here in late November at 10 centimetres. So it's drawing that moisture up here. Now, what we can see here, as that starts to plateau out, it starts to draw moisture up at 20 centimetres. We've got a rainfall here that occurred that topped it up nicely. And as we can see here, we get drawdown. That steeper gradient there means that that's maximum water uptake from that level in the soil. As we can see that plateau out, 30 centimetre comes into account. 30 centimetres starts to plateau out, the roots start to draw moisture up at 40 centimetres. So that kind of shows you, okay, that's how our typical plant will draw moisture up coming out of spring. So this here is a spring sign crop. So I was planting, this is how it would usually take moisture up. Now, what we can see here is this period here where we've let that 10 centimetre dry down over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. We can see it's dried down and we got some pretty consistent rainfall up until that point, but then it pretty much stopped. Okay, you might got a 4 mil rainfall there, but nothing really of note. So we can see here that it pretty much stopped. So again, these things here that are driving our decision making are still wet. But if we have a look at that period that suddenly it stops, sunny, warm days, we can see that's drawn up. Now we've got that irrigation or rainfall event that happened here. Now, that's filled up that 10 centimetres, yet the definition of that field capacity is when the water drains from that 10 centimetres to 20 centimetres, we're at field capacity. Well, we can see here that water drained from 10 centimetres is drained into 20 centimetres, but we're not at field capacity. We're not at that full water holding capacity of that soil because we can see that's up here. So what has happened, we've gone through a period where we've completely dried that soil out. It's flatlined. That 10 centimetres is flatlined, and it's pretty much the plant has drawn out as much moisture as it can within that top 10 centimetres of soil. Okay. Now, when that happens, what you're doing is the micropores and the macropores the soil is really dynamic. As it dries out, the soil pores shrink and the ability to hold on to that moisture that water that comes through, again, especially if it's done via an irrigator, which is high application, decreases. So the ability to grab that moisture as it comes through decreases. So you can see here another irrigation event happened here. So we can see that here. And another one, and we still haven't managed to reach our point. Now, we didn't drive the 20 centimetres down far enough to impact that soil layer, but the 10 centimetre has. Now, we can see we've got a bit of a rainfall here that filled things up a little bit, still not to that point, and it's filled at 10, so it's filled up that 20 centimetres and it's filled it back up that 30 centimetres. But as we can see, we can dry down to that point there. As we dry down, we lose that ability here in February where our ETO, where our water uptake is where our plant water uptake is at its maximum. We have now lost the ability for that top part, the most important part of our soil, to hold that soil moisture. All right. So it's really key to make sure we're irrigating to the soil, not necessarily to the plant. Irrigating to maintain the soil in optimal conditions to hold on to the soil, to hold on to that irrigation or rainfall. Now, to solve this problem, or to, not to solve it necessarily, but to fix this problem or to delay this problem, we need to look at irrigating sooner here. So when I say irrigate sooner rather than later, we want to irrigate not necessarily to the plant, but to the soil. So if we had smaller irrigations here that meant that we'll creating upticks here in these 10 centimetre soils, we could hopefully prolong this longer and longer. So then majority of our water uptake in our peak growing period, our peak water use period, was coming from our top 40 centimetres, as opposed to down here from that 50 to 60 centimetres. So when I say irrigate sooner rather than later, it is not necessarily to match crop demand. What it is to make sure our soil behaves and we can utilise our soil for its water holding capacity for as long as we can. There's most likely going to come a time of the year where it doesn't matter. The demand of the crop is so much that it's just going to suck that dry. And the fact that, yes, cereals come on, you're trying to irrigate cereals, you're trying to make sure you're keeping your head above poppies, then spuds come into the mix. Well, the fact that you can get everything around or put the water on, or the fact that the season's potentially dry, you won't necessarily maximize that. But what you can do it is make sure it's going as long as possible. And then what you can also do is you're saving that subsoil moisture for later in the season as well. The other thing you're doing is making sure that you're getting good root growth and good root architecture at depth. This idea that drying out your plant means that it goes looking for water, it doesn't really work like that. The things that drive root growth is low penetration resistance. So how easy is it for your roots to go into the profile? And penetration resistance is linked 1-to-1 with soil moisture. So the wetter the soil is, the lower the penetration resistance is, the more likely your plants are able to get roots deeper down in the profile. Your roots are already in the profile. The roots aren't growing as the season goes. Your roots are already growing in the profile here. They're just waiting for when they need that water. So that's the reason why we want to try and irrigate sooner rather than later. So if we talk about from dryland grazing then to irrigated grazing. And I know I banged on about that, but that's a really important concept that we want to understand when we talk about that. So when we look at this irrigated grazing here, again, we want to start irrigating sooner rather than later. We haven't had a period of waterlogging. So this here is an irrigated pasture. We haven't had a period of waterlogging through here. And again, I mean, look at this, quite a lot of irrigation here in last year in summer, but we just didn't have the ability to wet it up to the point that we wanted to up here, that we have got through winter when ETO was fairly low. So we can already see here that soil moisture has already been used up in August. So this is an irrigated grazing pasture. So if this was a dryland pasture, there's not much you can do about it. But the fact that it's an irrigated pasture, we have the capacity to irrigate to make sure that we don't go into what we saw in that previous graph. Now, the rainfall we get, and it fills it up. If we get good rainfall this week and it fills it up, that's fine. But what we have here is already an early warning system. If I don't get, and we might have beautiful rainfall every week for the next 4 or 5 weeks, that's fine. And that's great. And I hope we do. But then this is already a bit of an early warning sign to go, well, my pasture's already kicked off. If I don't get that rainfall that I was hoping for, I need to make sure I supplement it with an irrigation to keep my pasture going on the way it's going. So that's a really important thing to understand there. And I'm going to talk about matching ETO. So right now, if you've got this here is ETO from one of our weather stations that is using a crop factor of 1. Now, if you look at that crop factors, that's a pasture at about 20 centimetres in height. So if you've got a pasture 20 centimetres in height over the last 7 days, it's using an average of 1.8 mils per day. So 1.8 times 7 is 12.5 mils a week that is being used by your pasture. Now, any rainfall that happens now is, if you get 12 mils of rainfall in a week, or 12 to 15 mils of rainfall a week, that is going directly to your pasture growth. That winter refill period, we're pretty much past. So any rainfall we get is going to be taken up by the pasture. And then keep in mind that these ETO numbers will increase as the season increases. You've got increased sunlight hours, increased warmth, and if you get windy spring, then that also increases your ETO as well. So understanding that the rainfall that falls, if your pasture is now growing, it's now using water, and is that period of winter refill, which would usually, rainfall now would be part of winter refill or that waterlogging period, whereas now it's actually going into pasture growth. So now we jump to autumn sown cropping. So I'm going to include in those carrot seeds, pyrethrum, some of your pasture seed crops, things like that. So things were sown that have sat through winter. So the same thing, I'd put them in a similar basket and similar advice when it comes to autumn sown cropping as I would an irrigated pasture. So again, start irrigating sooner rather than later. It hasn't had a period of prolonged waterlogging, which is what we usually experience, but and the root architecture is already there. It's developed. Okay, so I've in a normal year where we do sit wet, I've done soil cores in carrot seed crops, and there's roots already down to 70, 80 centimeters. The plant, they're like little ducks. All right, they're sitting about that big on the soil, on top of the soil. They don't look like they're doing much, but roots are going down in deep. Okay, again, low penetration resistance is the greatest impact when it comes to soil to root growth. And so they've already got their roots down there. So for those kind of crops that will take off, once they go, it's the early warning signs that we want to see. It's similar to what I spoke about with the irrigated pasture. So we can see here, this is data from last week. We can see that this particular crop here is the carrot seed crop. We can see that it's already started using up that soil moisture in the top 10 centimeters, and it started using water at that 20 centimeters. Now we got that rainfall last Sunday, which is good. It topped things up, fantastic. But that's what I'm saying is a warning sign. We know that we shouldn't be surprised when it just takes off. If say we get the rainfall this week and then we have a nice dry week and we have say a rainfall hopefully the week after, and we go, yep, fine, we don't need to irrigate. But now that we've seen this, there's no excuse to go, oh right, I don't need to irrigate, or I need to hold off. So they're the kind of the warning signs that we want to see. Because we want to avoid this. All right, we want to avoid relying on our subsoil moisture for our greatest source of water during peak plant water use. All right, So that's really important. And for those crops here, it's usually this area here. Windrowing happens in February, March, but that period here again, this drawdown happens there, and it happens very, very quickly. So if we then go into spring sowing crops, realistically, looking at the way the season is, it's pretty good. Happy days. When it comes to spring sowing, drier the spring, the better. When you have enough irrigation, the drier the spring, the better, because we can actually get onto our paddocks. We can still got more time to put drains on. We're not sitting wet. You can put fertilizer on sooner because you're not putting it in a waterlogged environment. You can get your tractor over those things. So it's not a bad situation to be in for spring sowing crops, but still sooner than you think. Okay, so we look here, not this in 2001. Similar thing to what we're talking about here. All right, this will take off. So it was sown in early September. We can see here, early August. We can see here that taking off after a month or so. It's already taking off. We can see it's drawing up there. So once they go, their roots are growing into that profile as a spring sown crop. Nice full profile, low penetration resistance, away it goes. And let's make sure, so you want to make sure you're irrigating to make sure that you maintain the maximum water holding capacity within your top part of the profile, so you're not relying on that subsoil moisture later on in the season. But again, don't let the poor performing parts of your paddock hold you back. So if they are, and they're a perennial issue, is drainage an option that can alleviate that? Can you improve those poor performing parts of your paddock, as well as making sure that you're keeping up with the best performing parts of your paddock? So when you look at spring sown cropping, a lot of the probe data we use probe for the dry end. Okay, so if I'm setting up an irrigation scheduling when I'm using soil moisture probes, we put it in a drier than average side. We put it in those best performing parts of your paddock, but we don't, because we don't want to pull down their performance. But it doesn't mean we discount the wet parts of the paddock. Okay, if the wet parts, yeah, that's a part of that's part of a variability in paddocks that we have to deal with, and that's the reality. So what we need to do for setting our irrigation scheduling, we use the probe for the dry, and we use what we see for the wet. Okay, use your experience for the wet. Yeah, Marek, that's great. You've got your lines in to take into account where the probe is, but I can't get over my paddock, or it's affecting the wet part of the paddock. No worries. Let's tighten those lines a bit. Let's make sure that we're irrigating to a window that helps more of the paddock. Okay, and if you don't have a probe, which is more than fine, use your shovel. All right. People, when I say, look, probes are a great tool. They're a fantastic tool, but they're just that, just a tool. They're no more, and I'd even say they're less important than your shovel, because if you have a probe and you dig a hole near your probe, what that probe is doing is giving you reference for what you're actually seeing when you're digging a hole. So when you go dig holes around the rest of the paddock, you can reference that to what you're seeing where the probe is. And even better yet, you can go to another paddock that doesn't even have a probe in it, and same thing. You're using what you've used that probe to calibrate your mind with what you're feeling with your hand. So yeah, shovel's your best friend. Dig more holes, dig deeper holes. And make sure that we can try and just bring in line more of the paddock based on topography and soil type within it. So the key takeaways from today's webinar is, from the data that we've got and the people I've spoken to around the state and different regions, great August growth, can't deny that. But how is the growth now going to impact on your feed window for your enterprise? All right. Now that's really that you might have the same growth as the bloke next door, but if you are finishing cattle earlier, or you have sheep and he has cattle, or you have the ability to irrigate fodder crops, whatever it is, will make a difference to the levers you can pull and how that feed window will affect you. So that's really one to consider. So work out where your peak demand is for a normal year and go, well, is that going to line up with that? Is it going to finish sooner? Or it's not a problem because my dams are full and I've got other areas that I can supplement that with. It's the wet conditions this season are less, haven't been as prolonged, or they haven't been there. So plants will take off sooner. We can already see that. They're taking off. Anything that you're sowing will also take off sooner because it's not going to be in that period of waterlogging. Any irrigated cropping, those autumn sown crops, same thing. They'll take off sooner. So that's really one to consider. So that means you may need to irrigate sooner rather than later. All right. So that means you need to go to the machines and make sure they're doing what they should be doing rather than going to start it up and finding a nasty surprise. Those frosts that we had 5-6 weeks ago, have they split pipes? Have they damaged anything within the irrigation lines? They're the kind of things that you don't want to find out if you're already behind the 8 ball when it comes to irrigating. You want to find those out before you actually wanted to put your first irrigation on. Use the data to guide your assumptions, such as wet parts of the paddock, water in your driveway, things like that. Okay, use the data to actually see where we are in a normal compared to a normal year. And the longer that we get this data, and we've seen from the data on King Island and more importantly that data from the Derwent Valley, from the Bothwell region, we can only do so much with the data we have, but the more data we collect, the more valuable it is. So if we can start to use that data as a guide to changing our assumptions or guiding our assumptions, hopefully we can make sure that we're making better decisions there. And the last one, you can't manage what you can't measure. All right, whether that's moisture probes, whether that's using weather stations, whether that's shovel, whatever it is, if we can get good measurements of where we are in relation to prior years, and if more importantly, if we can match that with good record keeping, we can start to see the levers we pulled or the decisions we made in previous years that may have got us out of a poor situation or may have come a cropper because we just kind of pushed it too far. You can start to see, right, I am at the same point I was last year. I did this and it worked. I'm confident I can do this again. Or I did this last year, but we're a little bit drier, so maybe I need to just tweak it a little bit. If we can match really good record keeping with the data that we're collecting around the state, whether it be soil moisture data, whether it be ETO data, hopefully then that gives you confidence in pulling levers rather than just sitting and waiting and hoping for a great spring. So they're probably the big things to take out of this. Just one here. Again, what I've spoken about, we could have next week could give what they're forecasting and things could look a bit different. So that's always there in the back of your mind, so how that comes about. But while I'm doing this is one that I do like to touch on, is that we see the BOM, they'll put their forecast out to tomorrow or today, it's up to 7 mils, 4 to 15, 4 to 15, 2 to 15, well, 4 to an inch, 1 to 15 and 1 to 10. Now, the optimist can look at that and add up 7, 15, that's 45, what do we go? 70 mils is going to fall over the next week, all right? But if we need to learn how to read these. So this is a screenshot that I took that kind of illustrates it nicely. So if we can see here that the chance of rain, so the chance of 0.2, just one tip of the rain gauge tipping over those 24 hours is 90%. All right, there's 90% that there will be any rain. Now, if you're a real pessimist, you're going, well, it's not 100%, so it might not even happen. So 90% that there will be any rain at all, so 0.2 mils. Now, as we can see here, and then that's the chance of rain. Now, when we talk about possible rainfall, the first number here is there's a 75% chance. So if we do get rain, there is a 75% chance that we'll at least get 2 millimeters. All right. And so then the larger number is if we do get rainfall, there is a 75% chance that we will receive one or more, that there's a 25% chance that we'll receive 7 mils or more. All right. So when we look at these, we add up, the optimist looks at the higher number and adds those up, and maybe the pessimist adds up the smaller numbers. But making sure that we understand what the forecasts mean is an important one to take into account there. So in terms of forecast, there was a webinar on at the same time as this that if we knew about it sooner, we wouldn't have made it clash. But we're talking about short-term forecasts over the last week. This one here is talking about the understanding the climate predictions and long-term forecasting by working with Resilient Farming TAS, the TAS Farm Innovation Hub, and Tom Remini's speaking on that one. Fantastic to listen to, Tom. I've been involved with a number of workshops with him, and he's got some really good insights, some really good information. So that's one there that's online now, but it is recorded. So if you'd like to learn more about those climate projections and forecasting and what the difference is between the two, I recommend that's something you go on and find at Resilience Farming TAS and listen to Tom speak about that. In terms of just a bit more marketing on my side of things, next week we have the last of our AgriFutures funded workshops, which will be soil moisture monitoring and diving into that a bit more. So we'll be looking at the fundamentals. So some of the things we spoke about today, so looking at the fundamentals, but then how can we use that data for strategic irrigation? So actually looking at that on crop specific data. So if that's something you can come along to, and if you have any pointed questions or any data of your own, that's what we want to really do there is try and take the series has been looking at the basics. We've done Soils 101, but now this is kind of the pointy end where we actually want to look at how we can come up with a strategic irrigation scheduling based on your crop, based on your soils, based on your management strategies. So this will be a great one to come along to if you can. Hopefully it'll still be raining, so there'll be no reason not to. And also on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see there that there's the sign up to our weather station and probe network. So it's been free for the last couple of years as it was funded by the TAS Innovation Hub, but now it's gone to a subscription. So essentially we've got 47 locations around the state, and what we want to do is essentially just to break even. If it can break even, we're happy, because the data that this weather station network and probe network can deliver hopefully will add value as the data is collected, and we can get more of a greater understanding about what's going on. So if you want to scan that QR code and have a look and jump on and subscribe, that'd be fantastic. And look, any other questions that you have, interested in something like moisture probes or any kind of monitoring on your farm, look, feel free to give me a call, send me an email. Happy to chat to you about it. But yeah, jump on the Weather Station Network. It's a great way of a bit of a soft launch into ag tech. I know it can be daunting spending money on hardware and moisture probes when you don't fully understand what the data can do for you. Well, hopefully the Weather Station Network's a way of you looking at the data, getting comfortable with it, and going, yeah, actually that's something that I can utilise on my farm. That's something that I can get a good return on investment on. I can see value in that. So yeah, that's pretty much me wrapped up. I think I was only meant to do this for half an hour or so, and as usual, I've just banged on and gone for nearly an hour. But thank you for listening. And I've also just realised that you can see my face when it comes to on the side of the screen, so apologies for that. I thought I was incognito, but thanks for coming along. Yeah, if you want to share this, if you've registered, you'll get a recording of this. So if you came in late, that should come straight to you. You can jump on that and listen back to the bits you missed, or feel free to share it with anyone else that you might think get value out of it. So yeah, thank you very much, and fingers crossed we get a nice bit of rain this weekend. Cheers.